Just welcome everybody. Welcome to the Future Trends Forum. My name is Brian Alexander. I'm your MC, host, and cat herder for the next hour. I'm very glad to see you all here on what is, in Vermont, a very rainy day. So, before we get started, let me introduce you to a couple of things about the forum. Let me talk about where it came from, how it works, and the technology. So, Ella, if you could click to the next slide, please. Just so you know, this is a video conference discussion. It's a forum, a place for conversation, and it springs out of the Future Trends in Technology and Education Report, or FTTE. If you haven't seen that, that's a monthly trends analysis that comes out by email that takes a look at trend lines in education, technology, and their surrounding fields. If you haven't seen it before, go to ftte.us. You can download some sampled issues and sign up if you like. But that's a publication that comes out. This discussion that we have is basically a conversation springing off of the ideas and topics surfaced in FTTE. And FTTE, by the way, is the hashtag we use for our Twitter based discussion. Now, next slide. Now, just so you know, this discussion is one that is global in nature, which is really, really important. And we're going to see this in a little while when Phil starts talking about the LMS, because we can't really talk about the future of education in one specific nation. International environment is really where we should situate any conversation about technology, ed tech, enrollment, demographics, and so on. And you can see that with our conversation here. We've been having participants from just about all over the world, from Australia to South America, Russia to Northern Europe, and of course from all over North America. If you look at the little yellow tags, you'll see that I've led this from several different continents and locations, including Iceland, Malta, Finland, and the United States. So again, please keep in mind that this conversation is a global one. Let me tell you a bit more about the conversation too. We can only hold this, we can only have these events happen with the support of three different sources. Let me thank each of them and explain. The first is NYSERNet from New York State, a nonprofit that helps bring connectivity to New York's universities, colleges, and libraries. We're very grateful to them for their support. We're also grateful to Shindig because Shindig provides two wonderful sources for us. One resource is this technology that we're using now. Another is terrific people that really help make it all work. And you'll see right now on today's event, we've got people like Tara and Christopher, Ella, and May. Now, speaking of the technology, let me just say a word about this. If you're new to it, or if you're new to this particular form of video conferencing, let me just show you a couple details about it that are maybe different and very, very useful. First, where I am and where this slide is right now, this is the stage. This is a kind of broadcast site. Like if you're in an auditorium, this is literally the stage. And this is where our guest will be joining us and where individuals can join us as well during the conversation. Below us is what I think of as the audience swarm. This is where all of you are. If you take a look around, you'll see individual icons. Some of them are black and white silhouettes, some of them are photos, some of them are videos. So right now you could look at, say, Mark wearing a suit who is wondering why I'm singling him out for attention. What a mystery. And you can see all these different people, and their icons will move back and forth a little bit, like they're in a crowd, swaying back and forth. Now, you can interact with people in that crowd simply by double clicking on their icon. If they're happy to talk to you, your two icons will click together like Lego bricks, and you'll have your own private audiovisual bubble. But each of you can still hear what's going on up here on the stage. Now, I know there's a stage. I'm talking to you right now, but this is a conversation, and we've given you four different mechanisms to participate and contribute your thoughts, questions, comments, pushbacks, and howls of outrage. So first, take a look again at that teal strip in the bottom right corner of the screen. You'll see these three different icons. The first one is a question mark. Click that, and you can type in your comment or question. And when the time is right, we'll flash it on the screen for everyone to see, and I'll read out loud for everyone to hear. Now, if your mic and your camera are working and you're in a good spot where you feel like you can talk out loud, you're not in the subway or something, click the raised hand. That means we can bring you up on stage. And right now we can fit about four people in a row up here. So you can join Phil and myself and have a conversation. Now, if you want to use text, another way to do that is to use a chat box, which I mentioned before. So again, on that teal strip, just click the little dialog box and you'll get a chat box for the room that you're in. That is the 16 to 18 people that have come in with you right now. If that's not enough, you can go to another tab or another browser and go over to Twitter and tweet using the hashtag comments from there. We already have a couple of observations right now. So, four different ways to contribute, four That's the way that this forum works. Now, there's one other source of support that I want to congratulate and thank, which is Patreon. We have dozens and dozens of people who have signed up to contribute to my future of education work on Patreon. So if you haven't been there before, it's kind of a cross between Kickstarter and NPR. You sign up to contribute a little bit each month to keep the lights on and to keep all the engines humming along. If you haven't seen it before, go to patreon.com/Brian Alexander. We're very grateful to all the Patreons who have supported us so far. Now, on with the show. So, I need to introduce a man who, in many ways, needs very little introduction. Phil Hill is one of, and I think for my money, the leading guru on the learning management system, one of the keenest eyed observers on education technology anywhere at all. He's a partner at a consulting firm called Mindwires. He produces e-literate TV, digital TV, and he's also one of the bloggers at eLiterate, which is an incredibly useful blog. If you're not following any of these right now, please do so. This is vital stuff. Now, Ella, why don't you push the PowerPoint to one side and bring Phil up on stage?
Hi, Brian. It's great. Really looking forward to the conversation today.
Well, I'm so glad you could make it. Just because I'm a glutton for punishment, why don't you tell me what the weather is like right now on this late June day in the Bay Area?
Let's see. 72, no clouds in sight, light breeze. Now that's
That
outside.
sounds rough.
Yeah, it is a rough day.
But you put up with it. You make do.
Yeah, we pay
very
for it,
good.
unfortunately.
Oh, I'm sure you'll pay for it somehow. Well, welcome. I'm so glad to see you. I'm so glad that you are willing to speak to all of us. Just to get things rolling, very, very quickly, can you just tell us what you do at Mindwires and what you do in your media production work when you're making all the illiterate stuff?
Yeah. Although when you work in ed tech, I think that there are other people that have similar problems to this. I just had my youngest daughter graduated high school. I had a bunch of relatives come in town for the graduation and had the amusing conversation of one of the relatives finally saying, "Well, what is it that you actually do?" And so I
Yes.
had to look at my daughter and my wife and say, "Can you guys even answer that?" So it's not a trivial thing, particularly if you do consulting. I guess the short
Right.
answer is we have multiple lines of business, but we're always focused on the effective use of technology in education.
Mm,
How
mm,
can uh, how can technology trigger a change that improves teaching and learning? That's the general focus. Within the consulting arm, a lot of it is advising schools on either vendor selection or determining strategy. Might even be change management. Hey, we're making this change. How do we get buy-in or get a shared vision? So it's
mm,
basically the stuff that to help make technology successful. So we're not really about the technology; it's the usage that we
mhm,
focus. eLiterate, the
mm,
blog, similar
mhm,
type of focus for blog and analysis. And what's
mhm.
probably relevant for this conversation is we also do a market analysis, and we're going to be broadening this out. But the initial version is looking at LMS and learning platforms. And so we serve a role where it's just market analysis, where are things going, and how to understand the moves in the market so that schools can make smart decisions and use it effectively.
When you say schools, what kind of institutions do you work with?
Well, I know I've seen two that are here at least. Any type of the schools we work with are all higher education. We do some work in the K-12 space, but only in the market
Mhm,
analysis. So when I
mm,
talk about working with schools, it could be community colleges, research
mhm,
universities, a lot of statewide systems we've worked with, private. So basically, any type of degree granting higher education institution.
very good. Very good. Well, it gives you a unusual perch, an unusual perspective to see the overall market of technology and education.
Yeah. Yeah. We've always ended up being sort of between a lot of areas. So, in other words, we're not implementers of technology. We're not technologists per se. We're not educators. We're not teaching. We're not in any one sector. A part of our role is to sort of sit between a lot of these and a lot of times doing connections. Quite honestly, a lot of times our role is marriage counseling, helping different groups figure out how to work with each other. But yeah, it has been a unique perch, but one that, as I said, makes it difficult to answer my mother's question about what I actually do for a living.
I get some similar jokes from my family when I try and describe what I do. Um, but let's dive into the LMS right now. And this is the learning management system, which in other countries is sometimes referred to as a virtual learning environment or VLE. The learning management system is, depending on who you talk to, the bane of people's existence, the anchor of their online teaching, the infrastructure upon which people teach with digital technology. It's an enormous force in the ed tech landscape, and one of the few universal technologies that I find in higher ed. Why don't you describe for us the state of play where things stand in 2017? And why don't we start off with the market share?
Sure. Well, actually, I'll take a step before and just agree with you. LMS is a strange beast, if you will. It's probably the most widely adopted educational technology affecting teaching and learning that's out there. But yet, at the same time, in so many cases, it doesn't actually get involved in teaching and learning. It's actually there to handle administrative loads, ideally, so that faculty are freed up to do teaching and learning, or quite often bring in other tools. So it's a strange beast, and it's very widely adopted. So one of the ways I like to look at it, if it's is we call it, the LMS is almost like the minivan of education. You know, everybody's got one. It serves a real purpose, but really nobody's that proud of owning it. And that's a lot of the view that we have of the learning management system, and for good reasons. But given that perspective, one of the biggest things that I'd understand is the market's been saturated for at least a decade in the US. In other words, each institution in the US has had a primary LMS. At least 90% or more of US institutions have had a primary LMS for over a decade. So it's a saturated market, is one way to look at it. We do a lot of coverage outside of the US as well. And if you look at other global regions, you get sort of a different picture. You don't get as great of a saturation, but it still is very widely used. And one thing that we're discovering is that several global regions are starting to look more and more like US and Canada region in terms of which vendors are the primary ones under consideration, the movement to cloud hosting, et cetera. So I guess just to start off, it's an interesting field where there's just, everybody uses it. It's very important, but everybody knows we want better as we move forward into the future.
I really like your minivan analogy. It reminds me of Microsoft Office tools. Office Suite, for example. Everyone has them. No one gets excited about it, but you have to have them. Just two quick meta notes before we proceed. If you look at the screen, friends, on the very, very right edge, on the center of the right, you'll see a white box with the eLiterate logo. And if you click that widget will take you to a study that Phil and his team just released, I think, midnight or so?
Well, I had to get it out in time for this session this morning. So yes, it was done in the evening.
Well, I appreciate that. And again, I'm leading off with some questions, but I'm sure you folks will have some. So please click on that teal strip to use whichever way you'd like to approach. So you're describing how the market was changing around the world, how other countries are starting to look like the U.S. and Canada in terms of LMS. Can you say more about that?
Well, let me explain what I mean by global regions. So, because we don't have every area of the world that we have data. Well, we have data across the world, but we're sort of expanding our coverage in a region by region area. So when we have a region, we say, hey, we have confidence in the data. We can draw conclusions. We've talked to people, then we release it. So besides North America, we're covering Europe, Latin America, and what we call Oceania. Not based off of loss, but basically Australia, New Zealand, and sort of countries. So within those regions, let me pick out one example, Europe. Europe had long been known to not only have a lot of Moodle and a lot of Blackboard Learn, but they had a series of these smaller vendors. Oftentimes, they were open source vendors. There were solutions like Ilias. There was Clariline. Stewed IP, and I'm probably not even pronouncing these the correct way, but there's a whole series of these vendors that were very region specific. They were used in Europe. You had some slightly bigger ones like It's Learning and Frontier,
Mm-hmm.
but you
Mm-hmm.
had a whole series of Europe specific vendors. And I think a lot of times that's the way we assume things are, is that each region has a lot of their own solutions. Well, one of the trends we're seeing, which could be considered problematic, could be a good move. I mean, we're trying to point out that it's happening. We're seeing virtually no new adoptions for these region specific solutions. So you're
Mm-hmm.
seeing a lot less, and there's a lot of, take Clariline, a lot of Clariline customers that are migrating to Moodle, for example. There's a lot of people migrating to Canvas from all different sources. But when you put it together and you look at Europe and you say, which are the most active platforms in terms of who's being considered as a
Mm-hmm.
solution for an institution, well, guess what? It's Moodle, it's Blackboard, it's Canvas, it's D2L Brightspace, and to a smaller degree, much smaller degree, Sakai. And you start saying, wait, but those are the exact same ones we're looking at in North America. And I would add one other piece. Europe has long been considered to be a place where data privacy is handled more stringently than in the US.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, it's unlikely to go to cloud hosting. Well, we're actually seeing a pretty big move towards managed hosting by the vendor and cloud hosting. They don't have the saturation level the US is getting. But so that's what I
Wow.
mean by similarities. All of a sudden, we're talking the same primary vendors, the same primary choices, and
Yeah.
we're talking the same hosting models. So as a quick, well, I guess it wasn't
Mm.
quick. As an answer, that's part of what I mean by starting to look similar the different markets of the world.
So if I can take a step back, I mean the two leaders that you're seeing right now are Blackboard LMS, Blackboard Learn, and Moodle, in different forms, hosted or locally hosted and so on. And you see Canvas as an up and coming solution, which is nibbling at the lead of the big two.
Yeah. Yeah. And I described it in the post that I put out last night. And by the way, that was put out sort of late. So if there are any typos, it's purely the fault of Ale Smith, which is an excellent beer. But if you look at installed base, you have a duopoly. It's interesting. In all four of these
Mhm.
global regions, the number one and number two are Moodle and Blackboard Learn. There's a lot of significance of that, and it's been true for many, many years. So, straightforward answer is yes, those two have dominated from a global region perspective. Moodle more so than Blackboard, but Blackboard, if you look at Blackboard, you also have to say that they do a lot of Moodle hosting, so they sort of have
Right.
their hands on both sides. If
Right.
you look, however, at who's gaining new customers, and what I mean by new customers is people migrating from a different LMS into a new one. Well, by far, Canvas is the leading one in all four regions, really. But probably what I would say is number two is D2L Brightspace. And they've actually come on strong in the past year due to several different reasons. But so you really have these four vendors, two with the biggest installed base, and then another two that have a lot of momentum going in, particularly Canvas. And it's the same vendor, but like I said, we see something roughly similar across the various regions. Not perfectly similar, but it's more similarities than I would have guessed a year or 2 years ago before we did the research. One of the actually, I'll add a little bit of some of my thoughts on why is it that we have so few vendors that are competing not just in the North America but also in other regions. Um, First of all, we're always sort of concerned with what the health of the market is. And to be quite honest, there is something that's a little bit troubling if you consider four vendors primarily dominating such a wide swath of ed tech in so many different global regions. We don't see it's different than, say, 5 to 10 years ago, where you were concerned significantly with anti competitive behavior. But even though we're not seeing that same dynamic anymore, there still is a pretty big concern. How healthy is it that you only have four? Do we have enough different forms of innovation feeding into the field? And one area that that gets into is we've also noticed that a lot of alternative learning platforms have not really taken off to the level that I think
Uh,
people had hoped. So, for example, Brian, I'm still just going. So let me just finish one thought. I'll get it back to you.
please,
Um,
please.
so, for example, where our concern is you want to have innovation. Well, you have some markets like competency-based education platforms. You've got these new systems that were designed from the ground up just for competency-based education, and they truly take a different approach than an LMS. They actually focus more on the learner as a central data model as opposed to the course. And it actually allows for some pretty innovative things, such as how you communicate students even beyond the boundaries of a course and how they alter their time based on what they need. But yet, that's a sub-market that just has not taken off. And as a matter of fact, Ellucian Brainstorm, one of the primary vendors, just went end of life. So there's a little bit of concern with having only four vendors out there and with the sort of different approaches not really hitting the mainstream, at least yet. So not all is bad, but I will call out that is a concern of ours.
Well, thank you for that wonderful answer. We have a stack of questions.
Okay.
Well, I have a stack of questions, but people have a stack of questions, which are in many ways much more important. We have one from Sriram, who asks, did you say Blackboard is second in North America?
No, so Blackboard is first in North America and second in the other three global regions. Moodle is, and it's the reverse. Moodle is number 2 in North America and number 1 everywhere else. If you look at a broad base globally and said, across the globe, you would have to say Moodle's got far more implementations than Blackboard does. So Blackboard's, I would say, first in North America, second globally is the best way I would answer that question in terms of number of institutions adopting.
Very good. Good question. We have more questions. Ella, why don't you toss up the next? Thank you, Sriram. This is from Russell. Question about Moodle. What drove such wide adoption in Europe and other regions for Moodle over the years? Good
Well,
question.
I mean, the obvious thing is the fact that it's open source, so you can you can use it practically for free, at least in terms of cash out the door. So you could set it up on a server within a school and do it for free. And that now you can also do Moodle partners and pay somebody to do it, but even there it's fairly low cost. So the cost is a big part of it. I'd say the two other things that have had a huge impact on why Moodle is so widely adopted. First of all, it's modular. And so it's been set up to allow a lot of regionalization, people to come up with regional approaches and customizations of the software that fit what they're actually doing in a particular region. So it doesn't look the same everywhere. And then the third is actually an offshoot of that because of the Moodle community. It truly is an open source project, has drawn on a wide variety of contributions. And one of the things that's allowed it to do is had a huge number of language conversions that are done in the field. It doesn't rely on the Moodle headquarters to actually do all of the language localization. It can actually be done by other groups and then accepted into the platform. But I would, so I'd say those are probably the three biggest reasons I would say that Moodle has become so globally dominant in terms of installed base.
Just to look ahead to July, Moodle's founder and guiding spirit, Martin Dugaimas, will be a guest on the Future Trends Forum. So get ready for that. If you have more Moodle questions, he's the man. And we have more questions. Please, Ella, throw up the next one. And this is from Michael Berman about outside vendor. Do you have any evidence at all that Schoolology is making any inroads? And what about Google Classroom, which is big in K-12, but no adoptions in higher ed?
All right, the first one. All right, first of all, Schoology, not Schoology. That's a
Excuse me.
very common issue. But in any case, let's take Schoology. They're a very interesting platform, proprietary, not open source, very strong in the K-12 market, and have been for years. They actually, I think, were started within a year of when Instructure came along, so very similar time frame to the Canvas LMS, native to the cloud. And they have they're quite feature rich. If you really look at Schoology, there's a lot more features than you realize. At least I realize up front. And they're very well known for having a social stream interface, which is quite intuitive in the Facebook age for a lot of faculty to use. They raised a lot of money, and they have targeted higher education as an expansion to move beyond K-12 into higher ed. When you typically see the reverse, a higher education vendor trying to go after K-12. They certainly had a big win with Colorado State University Global Campus. They have some wins with, we wrote about, I'm blanking on it, in Illinois, a small private Christian school, Wheaton College.
Yeah.
But if you look at where they're actually succeeding, it's typically with smaller private institutions. So so it's more of a niche play right now, is they are going after the smaller schools and having most of their success there. They're choosing not to go after very many of the large RFP processes. So it's a compelling platform, and they're entering higher ed, but it's not having a broad-based effect yet. It's really it's a growing niche in a smaller institution. Now look at Google Classroom. We've written about Google Classroom. One of the benefits of them is they're Google, and so many people almost everybody uses Google one way or the other.
Right.
And the other thing is it's free, and it actually is a quite nice design for a LMS. And it's very popular in K-12. But I will say it's not popular in K-12 in terms of district-wide adoption that includes data analytics across a district for schools working with Race to the Top funds. So it's popular in K-12, but more of it's almost the gateway drug to ed tech platforms. Very popular, but not necessarily from the enterprise type of usage. And if you look at it for higher ed, they're probably smart. Google doesn't seem to want to solve the enterprise adoption problem. They'd prefer for other people to get their hands dirty dealing with that, dealing with deep gradebook issues, dealing with integrations with student information systems and how do you automate it, dealing with all of these rather difficult higher ed problems. So Google Classroom, we're seeing it in higher ed in isolated cases, individual faculty trying it out, particularly if it's a Google application for education school, but we're not seeing it as an institutional adoption yet. And I would say I don't expect to see it to be a major issue there, at least for another year or two. But it certainly doesn't mean they don't have the technical capability of doing it. I just don't believe they have the technical desire to get into this market.
Well, it's a silo market in many ways, and that goes against their business model and their philosophy. Before we have the next question, let me just explain something that should be on the screen. Off to the right edge should be a blue box that says Join Podium. So if you would like to join us and you're feeling really passionate about it, just click that button and you'll pop right up on the stage right next to Phil and I. And so we have, in fact, a forum stalwart. We have Kisa Johnson. Kisa, hey.
Phil, I got a question about, have you ever looked at Nouveau Ed? Can you hear me?
Yes. Say the name again.
Nouveau Ed, Novoed.
Yeah. Looked at them lightly, but I don't have as deep of a knowledge of them as others because we're not seeing, we sort of focus more on what are institutions selecting between, and then we focus on helping them out. So for that reason, I know about them lightly.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Because I was quite interested in because I've been playing around with it, taking classes like through IDEO, through Acumen, a lot of their social innovation classes, which I find very helpful in understanding a lot about
Hmm.
social analytics and even moving things forward full scale. I like the knowledge. I don't like having to go through a lot of some of the jumps and hurdles. I think they changed the platform a little bit more because I really like sharing and other people sharing knowledge and other people sharing their work. A lot of those things aren't built in current LMSs where people can share work, see the work that other people are doing. So I just had a question about that. And my other question was when you made the comment about the trends of seeing like how things are looking more westernized. Do you think that has anything to do with globalization, like
Hmm.
um,
globalization education?
well, before I answer that, let me call out two things. First of all, I think it's a great question, but I would point out that Moodle is really out of Australia, so
Hmm.
they're so far westernized they're Eastern. And then the second piece is I had an
You are so
interesting
funny.
perspective when I was in South Africa that it wasn't so much an Eastern Western. Down there, there's so much talking about
Hmm.
colonization from Northern Hemisphere versus Southern Hemisphere.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
but do I think some of this is caused by globalization? I do think that, yes, in terms of it's becoming more and more acceptable to get your information from the internet. So, sort of greasing the skids of sharing information to different regions. And therefore, schools outside of North America actually seeing what's happening in their region and in North America and other regions. So it's sort of breaking down the barriers. I think that's definitely a factor. But I think there's also an investment factor. So much investment in ed tech has come into the US space. And quite honestly, there's, a lot of that money is spent certainly by Blackboard and Structure and D2L with the
Hmm.
express desire to spend that money to achieve international markets. So, from that aspect, yes, I do think that globalization is a big part of this. I just have been surprised to the degree it's happening.
Yeah.
In other words, the logic makes sense to me, but as we did the research, I was surprised by the degree it's already happening.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. All right. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Ella, we have more.
One other point I would, Brian, one other point that I would,
Go
that I
ahead.
want to make sure that we get into. She brings up a good point about not everything should be about the LMS per se. And that actually is one of the major trends. It's a lot of this is
Mm.
how do you use third party tools or other tools beyond the big LMS? So they might be the institutional platform of choice, but at the same
Mhm.
time, we're getting a lot of movement towards using external apps in addition. But in any case, I'll be quiet and
Mm.
listen to the next question.
Oh, that's a good response. Thank you. Hello, Ed.
Hi, Brian. How are you? Hi, Phil. Thanks
Hi.
for taking time to talk to us. I've got a million questions, but I'll limit it to one. Um, One thing that I was concerned about, you mentioned earlier the administrative use of the LMS and also institutional adoption. And I'm interested also in individual adoption. So, do you
Mm.
think that the
Mm.
maybe the difference between institutional adoption as in over 90% versus faculty adopting the LMS may be tied to them seeing it as more of an administrative tool versus a pedagogical tool, and just your thoughts on why that gap may exist.
Well, let me try to answer that in two ways. Part of it's a time lag. So, for example, take the US market, which I know the best. Uh, I know better than I know the other regions. The institutional adoption happened, it was saturated over 90% by 2003. But it really wasn't until maybe 4 or 5 years ago that you could say the percentage of faculty actually using the LMS got up to at least 75 to 80% adoption. So some of
Mhm.
it's time lag because even if an institution has one, faculty have to choose to use the LMS in most cases. What we're seeing more and more now is there are a lot of schools where it's becoming policy. You have to use the LMS to submit grades. You have to do it this way. So administratively, that is driving up adoption, even though quite often the usage is pretty shallow. So I think that's part of it, is just the time it takes for an institution to make a choice, but then start setting policies, or faculty being convinced, yes, this is valuable for my classroom. So I think that's part of it. The other part of it, going to your administrative versus pedagogical usage, I definitely think that's an issue, but I'm not sure that's a bad thing. In other words, the greatest usage of an LMS right now is to get the administrative work done efficiently, out of the way, and almost be transparent. You almost don't want to see the LMS. You just want it to make rosters, grading, assignments, and other basic items just very easy, and you don't have to think about it. And in that way, then faculty and course designers, which aren't always faculty, but people designing courses, could then focus on, now I have more time to focus on what are the pedagogical tools that I need to use. Sometimes that's in the LMS, but a lot of times it's not. So I think part of that divide is not necessarily just a pure adoption of the LMS, yes or no. It's driving to a greater demand for, okay, we're using the LMS, but now make it easier for us to improve the pedagogy and not just the administrative. And I think that's a lot of what's pushing for such a strong demand for what might be called the next generation digital learning environment, or a learning platform approach, that you have the base unit solving the administrative problems, but then also allowing or making it easy to get these pedagogical tools out there. So long-winded answer to say, yes, I do think that divide is part of it, but there are different facets of faculty adoption to consider. And I'll add one other as long as we're on this. There's another, if you ask me what's the biggest reason that faculty took so long to adopt, it's because the systems were painful to use. The systems were not designed well out of the gate from a usability standpoint. They were designed before Facebook, before consumer expectations of what a system could be used to do. And it was way too much drop-down menus. It felt like a mini ERP. And so if you ask me the biggest factor delaying faculty adoption, it's poor design. Now, I do think that's improving market-wide, and I do think that's one of the major, if not the major issue that's driving Canvas adoption, but I think it's also affecting the whole market. But does the system, is it enjoyable to use, and does it make your life easier? That's the biggest factor, more so than administrative versus pedagogy.
Well, great question. Thank you. And a generous answer, Phil. We have more questions and more people lined up. Tom. I hope we have Tom.
Tom, the green wall.
I know. Well, we'll try again. We have Gary Bartanas. Gary, I'm glad you could join us.
You're on
Can't
mute.
hear you all.
Yeah, there. My microphone was off. Can you hear me all right? Awesome.
Yes.
Welcome.
Your answer just a minute ago, Phil, your answer was so awesome. Thought I'd put my hand down because you already answered it. What I was going to ask you is about the requirements for, faculty to use LMSs for grade input. Does that come along with the support of instructional design? And from what you just answered, I believe it does. I would hope, anyway.
Wait, let me make sure I'm understanding your question. Are the schools that are saying you have to use LMS, are they also providing instructional design help to help faculty design courses? Yeah. I'd like to say, I wish the answer were more of a yes than it is. What we see in so many schools is the answer is yes, but then you'll go visit the school and you'll have 2 instructional designers for an entire college or university. So if I had to give a simple answer, I'd say yes, but not enough. Now, there's some controversy about what should be the role of instructional designers versus faculty. But in terms of, hey, let's help faculty adopt this stuff, including what's good pedagogical usage. Yeah, in general, yes, but in general, there are not a whole lot of schools that do it very well. You know, there are quite a few that really are supporting faculty, but not enough.
That's interesting. I'm from Canada, and I'm very fortunate to be at a school that has, I think there's probably close to 10 instructional designers in our department. Plus we have learning technologists that work hand in hand with us to look after the nuts and bolts of the thing. But I'm wondering, if it's an exceptional thing, because what I mean. In like, I think we're pretty good off here at this school, but I'm wondering about the rest of Canada and the rest of North America. That's or it's like Brian said at the beginning of this broadcast. It is a global what we're dealing with here.
Yes. Yeah, and actually, let me get a little bit on my soapbox here. I think that the focus is support for.
Maybe didn't make sense, but
Oh, sorry, you're breaking up, Gary. I didn't catch the full thing. Oops. Okay, well, actually, I'm going to use that chance of Gary's connectivity to get on my soapbox. What it should really be a focus on is support of making effective use of technology. So it's not just the number of instructional designers. It should be central groups actually providing community so that faculty can help themselves, making it easy for them to connect and get advice from their peers within the school, peers in their discipline at other schools. There should be more self-help resources as well. So when it's like, let's support faculty from a pedagogical perspective, instructional design is part of it, but networking and community and encouraging faculty to be scholars of teaching and learning is a huge factor that needs more attention.
Yes, that's been underappreciated for about 20 years. We have more questions and only 15 minutes. So let me just see who wants to come next. And if you want to come on video, let me just ask you to introduce yourself. Fred's coming back.
Oh, Fred. I thought we were going to go quick. Now you got Fred up here.
Already the abuse begins, right?
That's right. No, he's going to ask a deep question.
Your audio is off, Fred.
Audio. Oops, there he goes. I'll check in the chat room too as well, Fred.
See if he's had a couple of comments. So who else is next? What other questions do you folks have? This is from Fred, actually in text, about learning analytics and massive student records. Are the current LMSs able to manage massive student learner info profiles, or has this been passed off to the student record system? By massive, I mean storing student data across courses, not just within a given course. Good question, Fred.
That's an interesting one, because one of the weaknesses of this market is the fact that these systems used to be called course management systems, and they were named that for a reason. The central design element was a course, and learners were almost, well, that's a field of who's in this course. We've certainly progressed quite a bit in the field so that there's more and more tools to connect students across courses or allow ad hoc groups. But I think for the element that Fred's talking about, really looking at a learner profile, seeing how they're doing across courses, making useful data comparisons, and helping students from a curricular level, for example, I'd say no, I don't see a whole lot of that in the LMS field. I think they've got the raw basics, but not the significant help that I think Fred is talking about. I see that much more in the administrative student record systems. And I would call out, if I go back to the competency-based education platforms, this is an area that they were intended to address, looking at a learner across courses and beyond the course. And unfortunately, as I said, they're not really hitting the mainstream at all, so it's not having the impact. But that's an area that attempted to do it. But in the interest of brevity, I'm going to cut myself off and listen to the next question.
And we have plenty of other questions. And this is Tom Hames coming to you from Texas. Hello, Tom.
Hi, good afternoon from Texas. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hello.
Okay, good. All right. There's multiple levels at which you can get muted. So the question is which one. But so I'd put up a question earlier, though, is that I don't think the question that gets asked enough with LMSs is how does it actually augment teaching and learning? I mean, it doesn't really. It has advantageous. It's advantageous from an enrollment perspective. It's advantageous from a logistical perspective for the administration. So it's good at getting students in that wouldn't otherwise be there, and it makes some records management more efficient. But is it really a better way of teaching in any way? And I don't think that question almost never gets asked. And I think there's a central design challenge in that. The way that these LMSs tend to be sold to faculty is it's just like your regular classroom. And as I wrote in the chat room a while ago, that's a classic McLuhan-esque mistake because it's a horrible metaphor for online learning. And guess what? When they get into the LMS, they discover it's a horrible metaphor for physical learning. And so, I'm just wondering, at what point do the faculty become educated enough in the way the technology works to where they refuse to play along with the systems anymore and the LMSs start floundering on their own contradictions? Or does that turn the LMS into purely a lightweight logistical administrative platform where you have your grades and your roles and things like that, and then everything else is outside the LMS? So
Sure.
Any thoughts on that? Are there LMSs that are trying to address that in your mind?
Any thoughts on that? That's a loaded question. I'll try to answer a couple parts to it quickly. The first one is the greatest potential for an LMS to help in teaching and learning is to get the other work of the course out of the way so that it can free up time. So you could say, well, that's not helping teaching and learning. And that's true from a direct sense, but I still think that's the greatest success of an LMS is it gets all the basics done and then frees up and encourages people to focus on teaching and learning. So it's an indirect role. But I think the other piece is LMS should not be seen as a monolithic entity anymore. That's not the direction it's going. I think there's a great movement to where the answer is the LMS should only play a pedagogical role where it does work out. And where it doesn't work out, it should enable or make it easier for faculty and course designers to pull in different third-party applications, but do so in a way that students don't have a disjointed experience. So my second part to your answer is the greatest opportunity for LMSs to support pedagogy is to make it easy for them to use their own tools when it's appropriate, or to quickly and easily use third-party tools, but not face an either-or type of approach. And I'll give one example, which I think a lot of schools have used, and there's some privacy issues, but Piazza is a discussion board. Everywhere that I have seen that used, I've seen a richer engagement of students than you would with a threaded discussion forum that typically comes with an LMS. But then the question isn't then do you abandon the LMS? The question is, does the LMS enable a school to integrate in something like Piazza and use it in a fairly seamless manner? That's the real opportunity, is to go in this integrated ecosystem type of approach. Now, you had a very loaded point at the end. What we really need to get to is get faculty in particular focusing on how do I make my class better. They should be interested in, hey, I don't want that because it doesn't fit within my class. I want a different tool that does this job. There's no simple answer to that question, but I would just call it out as that's probably the biggest need we have in the field is more of a culture of what works in teaching and learning.
Which
It
of
goes
the
back to your
LMSs allow?
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, which of the LMSs in your mind allow for this sort of federated approach the best? I mean, I always was very frustrated with Blackboard. Was yeah, we'll build it for you inside the walled garden, but
Yeah.
And
I'll
so I mean, what's your thinking on that?
Well, let's see. I'll claim brevity so I can avoid answering the question which is the best. Time's short here, sorry, but I will say the whole field is going that way. The whole market is going to a federated approach. The issue is their mentality or philosophy on how to go that direction is very different between them. Some of the systems are much stronger in control. We want you to use our tools. Yes, we'll integrate, but we want you to use our tools if possible. And then other ones are much more of, hey, we actually want you to use third-party apps. So, but I do have to say, I think the whole market is going that direction, but with different philosophical approaches.
Great, thank you.
I partially avoided the answer on that. I'm at least acknowledging it.
I think you did a terrific job. And Tom has really, really good questions. Rob, can you quickly introduce yourself and say where you're from? Well, while people are, here we go. And here's Rob's question. With all the talk around next generation digital learning environment, do you see any evidence that LMSs are becoming less of the place where learning content is hosted and more of a central hub to aggregate third-party learning tools?
Yeah, some of my comments about the learning platform ecosystem and NGDLE are aspirational and not just analysis. And what I mean by that is it's an area that I think we're advocating for. And unfortunately, part of what that means on the opposite side is I see more aspiration there than I see reality. What we're seeing a market uptick in is that individual schools, certainly faculty, but even institutions expressing the desire to get into an NGDLE type of arrangement. We don't just want the LMS to be the be-all, end-all. We want content to be in multiple places, or more importantly, we want to have access to various learning applications. Where we see progress is in schools explicitly saying that's what we want and attempting, and I really emphasize the word attempting instead of doing, to get their RFP processes set up to enable this. And I also see tremendous improvement in the market with standards of interoperability, and many of them driven by IMS Global. I see real improvements in interoperability. But your question was, do I see it in reality and in usage? And not broad-based. I see a lot more case studies of where schools and individual programs, departments, and faculty are doing it, but not from a broad-based perspective yet. There's too much where people talk about doing it, but then they don't do it. They fall into old habits. So I think we need to be patient for the actual usage to catch up to the aspirations.
It sounds, Phil, like in general, a lot of the LMS transitions that we've experienced over the past 20 years have had that kind of medium to long-term transition curve, where it takes time for Moodle to grow out or for faculty enrollment in LMSs to really build up. And there aren't many sudden transitions or phase changes.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right, and it might even be that we got fooled by the going from nothing in say 1998 to 90% of U.S. institutions having an LMS in 2003. Perhaps people started thinking in those time frames. Hey, everything we want to do in 3 to 5 years. The reality is that education's complicated. We don't have silver bullets. There's all. Learning is a very complex field. So I think that we need to be more patient in education and be more concerned, are we going the right direction in this platform usage, and less concerned with, are we there yet? And part of that's endorsing what you're saying. I think that you're right, that it is very long term. Most of these changes in reality are more on the 10 to 15 year time frame when
Wow.
people think they're going to be on the 3 to 5 year time frame.
So if we're talking about looking at the next generation digital learning environment, that really may be like in internet terms, that's geological time.
Yeah, no, I really like the way you're phrasing that. Yeah, I see the trend going towards the NGDLE concept or the learning platform concept, but it's going to take a lot longer than people want if you're concerned with actual usage, that it's really hitting sort of the mainstream, most courses. Yeah, it's going to take longer than people think. If we're patient, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But as you said, in the internet age, that's almost feels geological.
And I have to say, as someone who works closely with students, I don't want them to wait that long, and that's part
Yeah.
of the pressure.
Yeah.
But
Well,
speaking of
this
pressure,
also gets to the difference between you and me, Brian, as you sort of look to
yeah,
the future and where we should be going. And my
yeah.
primary role is in the analysis and what are we doing. So I guess this is an area where it's easier for me to say, yeah, sorry, it's taking longer than we thought.
That's no problem. That's a great difference. That's the Wayne Gretzky difference, right?
I
Skating
think
to.
that's the only difference between the two of us is that if people look
I
at
think
us.
I think hair might be another issue, but speaking of terrible pressure, we are at the end of our hour, and I want to respect everybody's time, especially yours, Phil, because you have been so generous and so responsive. We have to wrap things up, but let me just say a couple of things. According to Ella, there are about 30 questions banked up. So what I'm going to do is capture as many of them as possible and put them in a blog post. So Phil, if you can, if you want to whack at them, please feel free. But I want to make sure that we have those questions captured so that we can return to them another time and so people can see them. Because as you've seen, the questions from Fred, from Kisa, from Tom, these have been fantastic questions. We're really striking at the root of education and technology.
Sure.
Um,
And a quick answer, Brian, is I'm happy to use blog and take this conversation beyond here. I've enjoyed the talk, and yes, I'm happy to try to answer some of these offline.
Well, I'm delighted to hear that. I'm delighted to hear that. And again, I'm very grateful to everybody in the forum community for adding so much. Let me thank you again, Phil. And Roxanne, I think we're going to have to. We're going to have to drag Phil back on for a follow-up session because this is clearly rich stuff. Ella, why don't you bring up the PowerPoint slides and friends, if you want to stick around and talk for a few more minutes afterwards, the Shindig is open and we can keep doing that. But once again, Phil, thank you. Thank you so much. Looking ahead to the next week, let me just draw your attention to a couple of things. First, we have an unusual session. We have an experiment next week, and I would love to see what you guys think about this. The idea here is we're going to have as a guest all of you. And what you're going to do is reflect on current developments in education and technology with an eye to the future. So we're going to take a look at the past week, maybe the past month of what's happening in everything from the LMS to enrollment to finance to mobile, the Internet of Things, and see what you think. So this will be one where you guys have the floor, where you take control and drive the conversation. It's an experiment, and I'd like to see how this goes. So we'll try that next week, next Thursday. Now, also, if you don't have enough to do with your mind full of the LMS and thinking about what you'll be doing next week, we have fun for you. We have more reading. So, just look ahead a bit, by the way. Speaking of the LMS, not a major guess, just the creator of Moodle. We will have Martin Dugaimas on so he can talk about where Moodle is. Remember, half of the LMS world, one part of it. Now, also coming up, just to mention, we have our book club. We have just finished Lower Ed, which is Tressie Cottom's fantastic book about the for-profit sector. Again, if you haven't had a chance to read it, we had her on for a great session. Follow that link there on the blog, and we had tons of comments about what for-profit education means. Now, we just finished that on Monday. Coming up, go to my blog. We just put up a poll for our next book to read. And the next book is going to be science fiction, something about the near future So fire up our imaginations, give us some fun in the summer, and just let us think broadly about where education could go. So please vote on that poll. We have a lot of great titles, and we have some of the authors involved in the poll. And if you'd like to learn more about the Future Trends Forum, if you want to learn more about our FTTE report, go to ftte.us. If you want to learn more about this Shindig technology, go to shindig.com. And otherwise, stick around for a few more minutes to talk. I'll be here. And otherwise, I'll see you next time. Thank you so much.